Welcome everybody. Welcome everybody this very cold day. We have some interesting sound effect here. You're also, you're also happy today, so you seem to be talking to each other. But we have something better to listen to than that, and of course we have Chiara Cordelli here, which I'm very happy to welcome. Going to talk about the wrong of capitalism beyond domination. So Chiara is a professor of political science at the University of Chicago. She got her PhD at University College London in 2011, working with Cecilia Board, and before that you've been at Stanford. And you've written a lot in the area of social and political philosophy, and theories of distributive justice, normative defense of the state, and the public-private distinction in liberal theory, and ethics of economics in general. And I think that will be the topic in some way today too. So very welcome.
So thank you very much for inviting me here today. It's a true pleasure. I have to say I thought I was escaping the cold coming to Europe, the Chicago cold. But I think that, you're doing as well as we do in Chicago on that respect. So today, yes, I will. My talk is very much within the field of economic ethics. What I will try to do here, mainly, I have two goals mostly for this talk. One is to provide a critical assessment, a critique of what is progressively becoming a very influential critique of capitalism, which I will refer to with the term of radical republicanism. What is interesting about radical republicanism is try to develop a critique of capitalism by through the encounter of Marxist and socialist tradition on the one hand, and new republicans on the other. For those who are not familiar, republicanism is a political theory that the central commitment of which is to the core value of freedom as non-domination, which we may define as freedom from being subject to the merely unilateral or arbitrary or unchecked will of another. And my, of course, point in this critique is not to disparage radical republicanism, which I find it very interesting and intellectually important as a view, but rather to really ask the question of to what extent, if someone wants to build a critique of capitalism, republicanism provides a fruitful ground for that purpose. Now we'll also, through the critique, also try to make some positive contribution, in particular about perhaps how political philosophers should think about the concept of capital, and clarify also the relationship between ownership of capital and domination, and the nature of capitalism wrong beyond domination, distinctive wrong beyond domination. My second goal, more positive but also more tentative, if you will, is to sketch an alternative critique or supplementary perhaps critique of capitalism that focuses more on investment than on labor. I think labor is fair to say has dominated economic critique, philosophical critiques of capital so far, that centers on perhaps the political wrong of capitalism as opposed to interpersonal wrongs such as exploitation, domination, oppression, and that because of this has also perhaps some potentially distinctive institutional implications. So before I start, capitalism, of course, people have many different understandings. It's a very contested concept, but here I will operate with a very simple definition. Capitalism is an economic system where the means of production are privately owned, the allocation of resources between productive and other activities determined primarily through markets, and investment decisions are largely in private hands. And also, in terms of preliminary clarification, I should say that by far radical republican, by no means radical republican is the only available philosophical critique of capitalism. Perhaps in contemporary philosophy, three other critiques have dominated the scenes. One is what we may call the Rawlsian distributive critique that we find mostly in Rawls, include the view that welfare capitalism So a capitalism tamed by a welfare state is still likely to undermine fair equality of opportunity, as well as the fair value of political liberties, as inequality of economic powers tend to convert into inequalities of political power. Here the problem with capitalism is arguably understood in predominantly distributive and largely contingent terms, and in fact proposed solution is not really the proposed solution an exit from capitalism, but a more egalitarian capitalism, one achieved through the wide distribution of capital assets as well as regulation, for example, such as campaign finance, that should prevent the conversion of economic inequalities into political power. Second, other Republicans that, however, are not so radical, have argued that under capitalism there is a tendency not only to the generation, of course, of inequalities of wealth, but also that capitalist labor markets tend to foreclose meaningful exit options, and because of this, capitalism is prone to generate a condition of domination or oppression at the point of production, in which, of course, employers can freely boss around employees without much accountability at all. So here the problem with capitalism, to put it simply, is both interactional. It consists in objectionable relationship between specific agents, employers and workers, and is partly contingent, again, on background conditions. So securing sufficient exit option from labor markets through, say, a substantive safety net may go a long way in curing this problem, or perhaps we might want to add certain forms of co-determination, as Anderson does, as a potential solution. Finally, especially Marxists, of course, have long identified exploitation. So capital is extracting surplus value from workers as the core injustice under capitalism. Here there is a large debate about when and why exploitation is wrongful, but for our purpose what is important is to see that first some argue that exploitation may be unjust only if ultimately it results from an unjust accumulation of capital, so unjust background condition, and also to the extent that the actual extraction of surplus values depends on the will of particular owners of capitalism, it is argued that this account is destined to remain conditional, contingent on capitalist extractive disposition, maybe in a capitalism of benevolent capitalism, right? This would not be too much of a problem. So given this background, I read, and partly I can find this explicitly in some texts, partly is my own interpretation about what radical republicanism would have to contribute to the literature in order to be a truly distinctive view. So against these critiques, I think that the main contribution of the radical Republican critique has been the attempt precisely to defend the view that the distinctive rank of capitalism is neither distributional, nor merely interactional, nor purely contingent on either the history of capital accumulation or on capitalists' extractive dispositions. So I take it that this contribution can be unpacked in three theses. So the first is what I will call the non-contingency thesis. Whereas under capitalism it is possible to find workplaces which are neither oppressive nor exploitative for the benevolent capitalist, precisely like a benevolent slave master may decide to not exercise its extractive powers. By contrast, those who own the means of production always have, qua owners, the power to unilaterally control the labor of non-owners who must work to access subsistence. Of course, this is Marx, and this is in and of itself pro tanto unjust, even if capital was fairly acquired. So here, by unilateral control over labor is meant the fact that owners can set the terms of work in ways that are not directly controlled by workers in a non-reciprocal way. So the second thesis is what we may call the domination thesis, a central thesis, which says that the owner's unilateral control over labor is pro tanto unjust because it amounts to a form of domination. So to some being subject to merely to the unilateral or arbitrary wills of another. And interestingly, therefore, the point of socialism as the overcoming of capitalism is by means of worker ownership of the means of production and workers' control over the terms of labor, and it's the overcoming of domination. And the third thesis is, of course, that it's not of course, but the third thesis is what I will call the structural injustice thesis, which is what is unjust about capitalism. It's not the mere fact that some happen to dominate others, but rather that a structure, the system of, for example, legal system of private properties, confers the dominating power to particular agents. So in what follow, I want to try to argue that the radical Republican critique can prove neither that capitalism injustice is no contingent, nor that such injustice amounts to a form of domination, nor it can really make full sense of structural injustice under capitalism. And I hope this critique will pave the way toward a different, perhaps, account of the distinctive wrong of capitalism beyond republicanism, beyond domination. So in this respect, I think I should start with the first question is, do owners always dominate? Because remember that one crucial assumption of the radical Republican critique is that ownership of factors of production, ownership of the means of production, is sufficient to confer to owners the power to unilaterally control the labor of non-owners and those to dominate that. So here it's, for example, in Velusali's words, because the seed corn, the factor of production, the means of production, is concentrated in a few hands, so is the value of the net product it helps produce. And since unilateral control over the net product confers unilateral control over labor through the labor market, the seed corn, the means of production, becomes something it was not in a non-capitalist economy, namely control over people in the form of control over a thing. And this is why the seed corn becomes, for Velusalis and for Marx, capitalism. So this classical Marxist economic account seems to make three assumptions. First, that savings from past labor, produced seed corns, are sufficient to enable the capitalist to reinvest into further production. From that, in fact, it follows, second, that unilateral control over the net product of past labor, so the accumulated seed corns, in the form of ownership rights over the use of such product, is sufficient to confer to the owners unilateral control over labor. And third, capitalist profit and the savings to be reinvested into further production, so the value of produced seed corns, results from the extraction of surplus value from labor. So these seem to be the three assumptions. And I take it that one problem with this assumption, and here I'm following mostly Keynes, is that past savings or profits seem not to be sufficient for further production. They're not sufficient because further production necessitates, of course, investment in productive capital goods. And the overall amount, as well as the direction of these investments, do not depend on the amount of past savings, but rather, and crucially, on investors' subjective expectation concerning the likely prospective earning capacity of specific capital goods. So given the presence of money as a store of value, not simply as a mean of exchange, interestingly, the presence of money is something that economic account abstracts from, but given the presence of money as a store of value, investor can always choose between either investing in specific capital goods and those into further production, or they may exercise what Keynes called their liquidity preference and choose to hoard or to speculate, thereby foregoing productive investment. So this means, I take it, that the means of production, whether machines, steel, or seed corns, cannot become productive capital until they are capitalized. That is to say, they are attributed monetary value on the basis of investors' expectations about the future. So capital, as some Keynesian scholars have argued, then, is not mere legal property or any resources or means of production endowed with inherent objective productive qualities. Rather, capital is legal property assigned a monetary value through an expectations-driven process of investment. So as an illustrative example, takes the massive deindustrialization of the US Rust Belt in the 1980s, right? Here, rates of fixed investment in manufacturing collapsed at some point, and 2 million jobs were lost. Now, throughout this crisis, neither the rate of past savings, the presence of workers willing to work, or the inherent productive capacity of plants and equipment in the factories changed. Rather, what happened is that the US Federal Reserve engineered the Volcker shock. So when interest rates soared, expectation confidence in the future shifted, and major potential investors in manufacturing chose to hoard cash, thereby forcing manufacturers to shut down. So existing plants and equipment no longer counted as capital, even as their productive intrinsic qualities remained the same. And I think that this example well illustrates not only the difference between the means of production and capital, but also it serves to support the Keynesian argument that what makes capitalism in some sense distinctive as an economic system compared, for instance, to feudalism, is that under capitalism is not the past in the sense of economic accumulation of past savings, but rather the future in the sense of expectation about the future that determine the economic presence, determines the amount and of production through the investment in capital goods. So if the value of productive assets, and this was the third assumption, whether machines or seed corns, inextricably depends on an expectation-driven process of capitalization, so does the profit the capitalist can extract as a result of the productive process. So why does this this Keynesian story matter? Well, I take it because it shows that the fact that an agent has ownership rights over the means of production and over the net product in the form of rights to control their use is insufficient to confer to the owner the actual power to unilaterally control the working lives of others and those to dominate them. Because no single owner here has unilateral control over the overall process of monetary valuation of the net product, from which further production and thus the acquisition of the actual power to dominate labor depends. Hence, private ownership of the means of production and of accumulated past labor, the seed corns, I think is insufficient for domination. The owners of the means of production in this respect, and this is the message to Republicans, is very different from the slave master, often cited by Republicans, who, because the slave master has ownership rights over the slave, ipso facto also has the actual arbitrary power of interference with the slave, and thus the power to dominate the slave. But the difference here is that the capitalist's actual power of interference, unlike the slave master's power, is conditional on an external process of monetary valuation from which the transformation of means of production into productive capital depends. So whereas slave masters, we may say, always dominate, I think Republicans are right, those who own the means of production do not always do so. So one could say, well, why should we care? Like, one may ask, some owners make money, some owners lose money, but the truth is that ultimately there is always someone which retains the power to dominate, right? However, recall that one crucial advantage, I think, of the Republican critique compared to alternatives. For example, Marxist critiques focus on actual exploitation was supposed to be that only the radical Republican critique can prove that injustice under capitalism is not contingent on the preferences or disposition of particular agent. But of course, radical Republicans must also agree that complete absence of exploitation is also impossible under capitalism, for in their own economic account, capitalism could not possibly reproduce itself if no capitalist actually extracted surplus values from labor. Therefore, the non-contingency thesis, I think, can only be understood as the claim that whereas the total amount of exploitation is contingent on particular agents' preferences and disposition, by contrast, the total amount of domination is not, because the owners of the means of production, qua owners, always dominate. But if what I've just said is correct, I think that so interpreted the non-contingency thesis is false, for the owners of the means of production do not, in fact, always dominate, and how much domination exists under capitalism remains contingent on the subjective expectations and therefore dispositions of particular investors. Let's set this question aside and move to the following question, which is the question of, we agree that under capitalism some owners acquire non-reciprocal unilateral control over labor, but the question is, does owners' unilateral control over labor necessarily amount to a form of domination? Here there are many versions of radical Republicans. I don't want to go too much into details, but to give you a sense of the different arguments, right? One important influential version is Kantian's, and says that work relations under capitalism are incompatible with freedom as independence, where freedom as independence is understood as entailing the ability of individual to form and pursue ends without being subject to the merely private unilateral will of another. So I want to pursue my ends without those ends being picked arbitrarily by someone else or being constrained by someone else arbitrarily. So capitalist work relations in this view would violate freedom as independence, become some owner, as I said, unilaterally control the labor process of others, thereby controlling what Vrsalis calls their productive purposiveness, their ability to pursue ends through production or productive ends. Now, I think the problem with this view is that what violates independence cannot be the fact merely that I'm subject to someone unilateral control, for reasons that I will say in a minute, but only the fact that I'm subject to someone's merely unilateral control. So to understand the distinction, considers just property of home ownership, right? The homeowner's unilateral control for Kant can be omnilaterally authorized, can be authorized publicly, because everyone can will a system of private property, in Kant's view, as a condition of freedom. It follows that the homeowners has unilateral control. He can decide whether you can enter their house or not, and that definitely sets constraints on what ends you can pursue. But that unilateral control is fine because it's not merely unilaterally, and constrains everyone compatibly with their freedom. So really the question is, why cannot unilateral control over labor by some owners not be publicly, omnilaterally authorized compatibly with freedom? And here Kant can help. He says, well, for example, a system of private property that left some completely dependent on others, so left some with complete no property, would be in part incompatibly with freedom unless it is coupled, for example, by a public safety net, because it would make my capacity to pursue ends completely dependent on the discretionary will of others. But this problem is solved by something like, say, a minimal welfare state. So it seems that unilateral control over labor relationships may be not compatible, would not be omnilaterally authorizable if he left someone in a state of complete dependence, like this system of property. But that, of course, is not the case, because unlike complete lack of property, work relations under capitalism would not seem to necessarily violate our capacity to independently pursue ends. And must, as Brusalis point out, they're incompatible with our productive purposiveness, that is, our ability to independently set and pursue productive ends or ends through production. But it's unclear why Kantian independence should pick this specific kind of purposiveness, for as a free being, for Kant, I'm entitled to set and pursue my ends, but not to the free pursuits of any specific end or any specific end through specific means. So in principle, under capitalism, people can still form and pursue many ends that do not concern production in many contexts outside of the work relationships. So I would say that from a Kantian perspective, it seems that capitalism either does not dominate or does so merely contingently. It can be made perfectly compatible with omnilateral authorization through securing substantive exit option, think about UBI, safety net, and by securing sufficient leisure time for people to pursue ends outside production. So what about I missed the right order of the slides. There is perhaps the dominant view that supports the claim that control over labor amounts to domination is the Republicans' route, and here the idea is simply that producers are said under capitalists to necessarily have arbitrary power of interference over workers, and as they can set terms of work without the latter being able to exercise efficacious control over those terms. However, again, here the problem with this account is that having arbitrary power of interference over someone means in something very specific, means to have the power to remove or replace options for choice. Yet by having the power to offer a job to the non-owners and to control the condition of employer, the producer, it seems, only has the power to add options, however bad this may be, rather than to remove them, right? The owners of the means of production can certainly both oppress and exploit, because I can take advantage of someone else's vulnerability without reducing their options for choices. But if domination requires the reduction of options for choice, it seems that the capitalist does not necessarily dominate. Of course, one could argue, well, in a just society, the employee would start with much better options. But of course, so the capitalist reduces option by, for example, paying the employee badly. But this is not something any individual capitalist can be responsible for, nor capitalism itself, it seems, generates a reasonable benchmark price for the offer that the capitalist should respect, and against which legitimate expectation can be assessed beyond the benchmark offered by the market mechanism itself. So it seems the owners of the means of production can certainly, as I said, both oppress and exploit, but they do not have the power to interfere by simply having the power to unilaterally decide whether to offer a job or under what terms, however bad, the object should be pursued. So it seems that even in this second interpretation, the domination thesis is flawed, if at minimum. How much time do I have? Am I? I'll leave this in here. So I'll try to be quick. So at this point, we could argue, right, that however this story means something, because what's the wrong with capital is not so much that the individual capitalists dominate at the point of production, but that the structure as a whole confer a certain power of dominations to the owners. But what does it mean for capitalism to unjustly and structurally dominate, right? If, as some claim, and here I quote Verusalis, any given instance of domination is structural was just when it involves a triadic relationship between dominator, dominated, and regulator. So any social role that contributes non-contingently to the reproduction of the dominator-dominated dyad, end quote. So if this is how we should understand structural domination, it remains unclear how we can say that the capitalism reproduced the dominator-dominator dyad if, as I argued earlier, producers do not in fact dominate non-producers. So in an alternative account, the structure here, interestingly, becomes the dominator. So it is not the capitalists that dominate non-owners, but rather the capitalist mode of production dominates them by making some unduly dependent on the discretionary power of owners. But at the same time, it is argued, republicanism cannot be a theory of domination without agent. Domination must be agential. So it follows that structural domination under capitalism cannot mean that the legal system of property itself does the dominating, but rather, as for example Alex Gorovich puts it, there are dominating agents, the owners of capital, who dominate by creating certain structure through intentional action. So importantly, Gorovich argues that for structural domination to occur, it is not necessarily that the owners intend that any specific employee is dominated. All the owners must intend is to, or need to intend, is to defend the dominating system of private property in the means of production. So he makes this interesting analogy, says that in the same way in which Roman citizens intentionally maintained the institution of slavery by engaging in various social practices such as the capture and punishment of runaway slaves, in a similar way, those who participate as owners in the legal system of private ownership intentionally support a legal structure that enables domination. But it seems to me that while we may plausibly infer from an agent's participation in the capture and punishment of runaway slaves an intention to support slavery, given the complexity and the scope of the capitalist structure, it does not seem equally plausible to infer from mere participation in it an intention to confer to owners the power to dominate labor. So consider, for example, many participants in investment markets, philanthropic foundations, for example. They are key players in today's capital market, but they may invest with the intention of fostering economic development in the global south, and they may be right that if they stop using their property in this way, not only would capitalism not end, but things would get worse for many people. So we can derive from their participation in financial markets, as much as that reproduces a system by adapting the domination of labor, an intention to support the dominating system as such. And since under financial capitalism, as I argue, profit need not derive from the direct domination of labor, we cannot even infer from an intention to profit an intention to perpetuate labor domination. In fact, if you remember, Keynes' point about liquidity preferences, for example, is precisely that investors are keen to forego investment in production and those in the domination of labor when they believe that, say, other forms of profit making would maximize future return. So I will skip part of it, but the point here is that it's not clear who the dominator can be. If the dominator is agential, it's hard to pin down the agent because it's hard to understand what the intentions are under a capitalist system as opposed to, say, a slavery system. If we turn to a Marxist view of domination under capitalism as purely informal, everyone, like impersonal, everyone is subject to the imperatives of the market, we have no options to do but what the market dictates, then there might be perhaps a more better understanding of how capitalism works, but it leads us to the question of why capitalism is unjust rather than merely bad, because it might be difficult to identify the culpable in this Marxist understanding of capitalism as dominating us impersonally. So I want to turn now, concluding, to my most positive view, given regardless of what we think about radical republicanism. I mean, I think it's important to discuss that, but we might want to question whether this is a sufficient, perhaps, critique of capitalism. And it seems to me that there are reasons for thinking that it is not, and this is partly because by overwhelmingly focusing on labor, radical Republicans largely neglect, I think, money and investment. Sometimes money and investments are mentioned, but the critical focus of the analysis is mostly labor markets and work relationship. But once we focus on investment, it seems new morally salient feature of capitalism far beyond domination and exploitation arise. So in particular, two features of the capitalist mode of investment, as we may call it, are relevant here. The first is that by leaving major investment decisions to market, capitalism depoliticizes transformative decisions that determine the future course of society. So I have in mind decisions concerning the overall rate of investment, which in turn determine growth, as well as the extent and the direction of overall production, as well as how goods are valued in a society, which is itself partly determined by the process of capitalization. Second, something very much familiar from Marx. Of course, under capitalism, production is determined by largely uncoordinated investment markets, the logic of which requires that investors act not on the basis of what they reflectively believe is valuable or useful, but rather on their guesses concerning other investor expectations of future profit under condition of radical uncertainty. So such markets, as socialist economists have argued, are those structurally prone to deliver wasteful and irrational systems of production. Now, it seems to me that what I call I mentioned depoliticization matters morally because it impairs the conditions that will make it reasonable for citizens to see and to affirm their society as their product of their joint cooperation rather than as the result of largely uncontrollable impersonal force. And the feature of anarchy, on the other hand, also matters morally because it prevents citizens from relating to their society as an object worthy of affirmation. If production is anarchical, I cannot see the social economic structure of society as something having sufficient coherence to be affirmable. So, but how should we understand the nature of this problem? Seems to me it's not a problem of domination because there is no subjection to anyone's particular will. In fact, what is interesting here is that the problem is a rule of known. It's a form of impersonal governance and impersonal rulings of market. Therefore, it's also not a problem of relational equality because in some sense everyone is equally subject to this form of impersonal governance. So perhaps we should understand with Wahid Hussein this problem as one of authoritarianism, understood as the fact of being subject to a system of governance by market that bypasses our individual judgments by drawing us into patterns of activities of production or consumption in ways that do not reliably reflect what we have independent reason to do, or do so in a in an opaque way. So the critics is often made, for example, that markets cannot really incorporate in the appropriate way, say, environmental values. But this diagnosis, I think, although very interesting and partly correct, but fails to capture the fact that investment market, first, they bypass not only our individual judgment, but they bypass our collective judgment about decisions concerning the future course of society. Further, the diagnosis is insufficient because it seems to me there is something, and there would be something morally problematic with being governed by impersonal arrangements, even if such arrangement forced us into patterns of activity that were overall rational. And it's also in a reliable and transparent way. So imagine that, a very important part of your life, transformative decision concerning what careers to pursue or whether to have children, were made by a computer machine for you that was perfectly able to make them rationally and that would do so in a reliable, trustworthy, and transparent way. I take it that your subjection to the computer machine would still be morally defective, and the reason is that you would not be in a position to understand and affirm your resulting life as the product of your own action, because your agency would not be directly involved in guiding your own life. You would be in turn unable to understand and affirm your life as your own. You would be, in other words, alienated from your own life. So I would say, and of course I'm not the first to connect capitalism to alienation, but I think alienation has been a forgotten concept in contemporary philosophical critiques of capitalism. But I would say that capitalism structurally generates a morally defective because alienated relation between citizens and their socio-political order. And this is because under capitalism, citizens are alienated from their society because due to the politicization, they can understand and affirm their society as the result of their joint cooperation, precisely like in the personal case of the computer machine. And because of anarchy, they cannot relate to it in an affirmative way. They cannot see their anarchical economic structure as an object worthy of affirmation. So interesting, the moral problem at stake here is not one of active imposition of rules or decision on subjects by an identifiable dominator, so it's not one of domination, but rather it's a problem concerning the passive subjection of all to a system of impersonal governance in the absence of an identifiable dominator. And in fact, I take phenomenologically, the expression of this problem is not a sense of ingratiation or subordination of citizens, but a sense of powerlessness and detachment from economic and political institutions. So understood, and this is my last slide, the wrong of capitalism is not interpersonal, but is political. This is not only because it concerns the relations between citizens and their societies, not the relationship between individuals themselves, but also and importantly because, as recently, for example, Annie Stills or Catherine Liu have argued, but also following a very long tradition of, interestingly, anti-colonial thought, we may think of the commitment to non-alienation, not being alienated from your institutions, as something that is not only a fundamental dimension of political freedom, but also perhaps even a grounding value of political self-determination. So this way of reframing the wrong of capitalism, I think, partly changes or complexifies how one might think about the point of socialism. As I said, I think contemporary philosophers have mostly focused on the point of socialism as limited to the overcoming of domination and exploitation or to the achievement of a principle of distributive justice such as fair equality of opportunity. But so understood, if socialism has a point, it should certainly include what we may call the goal of reconciliation. So the goal of providing citizens with the social condition necessary to reappropriate their social political institution by overcoming alienation. Such goal, in turn, could not be achieved simply by means of workers' ownership or control, so that means privileged, for example, by Republicans, but would require providing all citizens with a right to participate, to be involved directly in the conscious planning of the economy and those of their society future. So I take it the repoliticization of large part of investment decisions, so the socialization of investment, and the planning of investment decisions become essential to overcome, respectively, depoliticization and anarchy. Now, one may say, well, this is a reduction, and then because of course, one reason why perhaps philosophers so much focus on labor, less on investment, and much focus on domination and exploitation, as opposed to this, is that right planning is because there are very good reasons. One might say with Hayek for why right planning is impossible. We need markets to play certain economic epistemic roles to deliver information. Planning is associated to the worst form of communism, of centralization. But of course, the planning that would be needed to solve the problem I've identified would not have to have the features of the centralized planning of the Soviet Union. There are, for example, very promising, I think, alternative models of participatory planning that are where major investment decisions are made nationally, perhaps, or at the federal level, but their implementation is highly decentralized. Here I put on the slides, for example, the model of Pat Devine, which is one of my favorite illustration of how participatory planning may work. And importantly, this form of planning retains, beyond the element of democratic participation and decentralization, also a role for exchange market, as opposed to investment market, where exchange markets are still in place and still able to deliver a certain kind of needed information. I myself, at this point, I'm reading on participatory planning, so I hope to, in the future, have more to say on the institutional details of what might be a more feasible means, but I end it here for now, and looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have audience here and online, so I just repeat the rules of interaction. So if you're online, write your question in the chat, and we allow for what we call hands, which is a new question, and fingers that are follow-up questions. If you want to follow up, write who you're following up to, and also present what field you're from, since we like to mix questions from different fields. With that said, I think we already have one question from the political science field. Bo Rothstein.
Thank you very much. 3 observations. One is, and I'm just repeating an argument from the brilliant economist David Ellerman. I think Marxists and neoclassical economists are both wrong, he thinks, in thinking that power over the production comes from ownership of capital. That cannot be, because in a market economy, capital can hire labor, and then capital decides. But in a market economy, labor can hire capital, and then labor decides. So, and such companies have actually become quite prominent, both in the US and in the UK. In the US, there are about 7,000 such ESOP, employment shareholder option plans, 10% of the private workforce. 4,000 are completely owned. In the UK, it has exploded from 250 to 1,650 companies due to a new type of legislation. And what is very clear from surveys of these companies is that those who work there, who are collectively owning the company, not only do they get higher wages, much more pensions, they also have a much higher satisfaction with participation and decision making. So it's sort of a kind of real. So the whole idea is that sort of power comes from owning cannot be correct. It comes from how the renting contract is constructed. Secondly, I think this whole discussion is missing one very important change in capitalism, namely the explosion of index funds. Index funds are now the biggest owner in the Swedish stock market and also becoming the biggest owner at the American stock market. They are the biggest owners in the world, basically. And what's interesting with the index funds is they are completely incapable and uninterested in wielding any power over the company where they have shares. They just invest blindly. They are also phenomenally successful. And here sort of is a kind of void in the system where capitalism is sort of abdicating in a way. And I think much of this discussion is missing these two very new developments in how sort of the market actually works. And I don't think markets and capitalism are the same thing. I think markets are much older than capitalism, but that's a third observation.
Yeah. So on the first, I take it your comments, and thank you for them, to add important things, but ultimately to support perhaps a case and to support the case for why perhaps also we should think more. I mean, we here, I mean also contemporary philosophical critiques about the relationship between ownership and power, and ultimately the power to dominate. The way I try to put here is that whereas I think the struggle between capital and labor definitely counts enormously to determine the division of the pie, so who gets what of the production, the overall amount of production, so the overall rate of investment, the economic presence, what gets produced, the direction of production is less determined by the same struggle. And there are questions concerning the expectation of investors and, as you say, entities that might not even have an intention to exercise direct control over how certain resources are used. So I take it that the first point as helping my story, that if you will, I put it in terms of how domination is not sufficient for. But I was interested in knowing why you think, though, I'm thinking about the normative relevance of index funds in particular. Why? So I mean, I understand why they are important, but what is in the fact that that the capitalists are uninterested in exercising power? So why do you think that story matters normatively? And
it matters enormously because you used to think of the managed funds, which are also very big, as faceless capital, but the index funds are headless capital. They don't even go, and they don't want to have any influence. As the guy who created this system in the 1970s said, don't look for the needle in the haystack, buy the haystack. So they buy blindly. They can basically be sort of replaced by a lottery machine or a well-trained monkey, and they live because they take very, very low fees, so they do not have the capacity to wield any power. This creates an enormous void in capitalism now, and there is a big discussion in Sweden where the managed fund people are very angry with them because they say you're not taking responsibility. Here is a void that, of course, could be filled by a democratic structure where those who work in the company are replacing the capitalists in the board, like in those employment shareholder option plans and in the British employee-owned business system. and the dividends that come out of this are truly very impressive when it comes to well-being, but also what I think is very important is in this way ordinary employees also get money from the profits, and big money, really big money, especially when they retire. So for example, take Publix, the biggest such company in the United States with 220,000 employees. When an ordinary cashier after 25 years steps out, retires, she leaves with her basic pensions and then $2 million. And we see the same again and again. So this is, I think, the only way we can do something with the explosion of economic inequality in our democratic system.
Yeah. So I just very briefly on this. So I take it there are many exactly normative reasons for why these things matter, especially in terms of their inegalitarian outcomes. One interesting, perhaps direct connection to my argument is that this point that you're making seems to strengthen the case for the impersonal domination thesis, but then if the market's really impersonally dominate, it's no longer domination, which is partly the outcome of my view. But it seems to me at the same time that there is a difference between willingly give up your control and those your responsibility. You may still retain responsibility if you willingly give up control on, say, your company or companies you're sharing. And the claim that the markets necessarily deresponsabilize, which I take to be partly Marx's claim, it's a claim defended recently by Claire Roberts and others, which is the view that regardless of what your intentions are, regardless of whether you retain control or not, still, one, you occupy a social role that is fully substitutable. So if you step out, you are going to get replaced by another capitalist subject to the same imperatives. And second, once you are in the role, you have to act according to the imperative of the market. That view instead, it seems to me, does create a condition of deresponsabilization, regardless of what the capitalist will or not, and what kind of power and control the capitalist gives away. But thank you for the...
Are you happy with Bo? I think there was one question that Bo asked that I'm not sure you answered. That was the idea that, labor can hire capital. It's not only capital that can hire labor, and that might change things very much. I'm not sure if you got a reply to that. Oh.
What the index funds are doing is actually renting out capital to companies. That's what they're doing. And if we in this room can start a business, right? We can go to some pension fund and bank, and we can get the capital, and we can and then we decide, not the capitalists. That's sort of, so the whole idea here that capital in itself gives power in the production cannot be right, because it is how the renting system works. And the renting system is changing now. One area where it changes very quickly is in high-tech. In high-tech, capitalists, those who own the company, are so utterly dependent on what's in the brain of the workforce, so they actually here in Sweden want to make them co-owners. They are actually propagating for it must become more easy to make our employees co-owners, because they are irreplaceable, and sort of everything that is interesting in their company is it's not in the machine, it's not in the buildings, it's in the head of those who work there. And these companies are actually more successful, more productive, and one very important thing is that people are much less likely to get into all those work-related diseases that we see, burnout, depression, from not being seen, respected, and taken into account at their workplace. So there are really very good empirical evidence for this.
Yeah. So I take it, and tell me if I misunderstood, but I take it not as an objection to, but it's almost an objection. Yeah, it's an objection to, and one that I very much share, to a certain kind of way in which republicanism understands the relationship between power and ownership. And in this respect, I put here a new slides, right? Recently, some Republicans have argued, well, look, you don't need to be a completely non-owner or to be completely dependent for your subsistence on someone else's capital. You can have some capitals, maybe you can rent it in the market, maybe laborers can hire capital, but you're still dominated because ultimately you do not control the process. So under capitalism there are inequalities of power that generate ultimately by the system of private property, such that even if you are an independent owner of capital, you might still, the way you want to use it to form your company will still be forced to track rules and terms that you do not directly concern, and that is domination. Now, one thing and again, thank you for adding to this, but one problem I had with this view also is that it seems to arrive to a conclusion that I don't think many Republicans are happy to reach, which is that everyone at that point is dominated under capital, because it seems that even the wealthiest capitalist, in order to be able to invest the capital productively, will have to be, again, dependent on a system of capitalization driven by preferences of other investors that the capitalist himself cannot control and cannot force the monetary system of monetary valuation or the financial system to track his own interests. And so in this respect, if domination is defined so loosely that you are dominate every time, even if you're a capital owner, every time your ability to invest capital is subject to other people's preferences and dependent on a process you do not control, then it seems to me the risk there is the concept of domination loses its grip because everyone becomes dominated under a capitalist system. But
a quick follow-up on that. I didn't see that problem, because you can talk about degrees of domination. Of course, some people are much more dominated, but we're all dominated, but some very little.
So what is the... yes, I have to say, I think most of the radical Republican literature, it seems to me, not all, but most of the radical Republican literature is perhaps willing to accept the view that domination comes to degrees, but when it comes to critiques of capital, they seem to want to argue that the capitalists are not dominated. There are some exceptions, like Lea Ypi has written recently a paper, but their point of difference in this respect with Marxists is that, there is a distinction between the owners of capital, so who do the dominating, and the workers who are.
I think.
But in terms of degrees, also, then my question would be: what is exactly the variable that determines the kind of degrees? Because if the degree is determined by my subsistence being dependent on a process that I cannot control, if it's the degree of control or is the fact that my subsistence depends on it, it's hard to me to understand domination under capitalism in terms of degrees, because it seems that in some sense, even if I am a rentier in New York, and that's what my subsistence depends on, my subsistence of renting a New York apartment still depends on a process of monetary valuation of New York real estate I have no control over. So it can't depends on control, and if I had to, if there was a devaluation of apartments in New York, my subsistence, not something else, would be touched. So then the question
I don't think we should get stuck in this, but I think it's rather simple. It's going to be, you need to have some kind of measure of how much your freedom is curtailed and things like that, and that's going to, how dominated you are is going to depend on that. Of course, they haven't developed that, but there's no mystery here.
No, I'm saying it's not that it's impossible to philosophically develop. The question is if then, under those, whatever criteria you choose to measure domination in terms of degrees, according to that criteria, it's true that the capitalist would be less dominated than the worker. It could be
exactly, and
I'm not sure
some
that would be the case.
And some capitalists are even less dominated than some other capitalists. The petty owner of a small company is much less dominated because he's much more dependent on the preference of others than Elon Musk, for example. So it wouldn't be so strange to have these kind of rankings. I think that would give a kind of better picture of what's going on, actually. We're all dominated, but some are much more dominated than others. Like we're all equal, some are more equal than others. Anyway, we should go on. Now we have Naima.
Well, thank you very much for a very interesting and inspiring talk. I think my